I'd like to turn it over to our next speaker. I spoke a little bit about him earlier, so I won't do the full introduction again, but I'd like to welcome somebody who knows how to talk about values communities that can, and talk to values-based communities that really can get through some of these complex conversations. Richard Call from BonCom.
Thank you for having me. Let's see if this gets us ahead. So today, what I want to come and talk to you about today is how do we reach conservative audiences? How do we find common ground with conservative audiences, an audience who hasn't been, I guess, on the forefront of this issue and sometimes creates tension, right, when we're having this conversation. And so I'm a communicator by trade. I'm the strategy director at BonCom, which is our strategy team is actually a cross-disciplinary team where we have a data scientist, a demographer, and a couple strategists in that team. And so we combine data in interesting ways to find solutions, communication solutions to bring some of these progressive issues to new audiences. Jumping right into it, one of the caveats I want to start with is sometimes when we start this conversation, we immediately jump into how do we convert or how do we convince this audience to think like we do or behave like we do. And I think, especially in a conversation like this, that can be a mistake that we make early. One of the most important reasons being that it creates a tone of conversation where we start talking at each other rather than talking with each other. I would suggest that we think about how do we create allies from different audiences. Allies bring new perspectives, both in the way they think about it and the way they want to approach the problem and find solutions. And that's valuable as we approach a problem this big on this scale. We need allies, not necessarily converting everyone to our way of thinking, but bringing in new networks and new ways of thinking and new ways of accomplishing these goals. And so I would challenge all of us as we think about connecting with conservative audiences and other niche audiences or different audiences related to this issue, that we look for allies, not necessarily converting them to the way we exactly think about it. One of the ways we do that at BonCom is the first thing we do is we try to find a common language. It's not just the words we use, but it's the values you see inside that language, and we'll talk about that in just a second, that are so important to this conversation. One of the ways we've done that at BonCom is we have a data scientist on our team who's developed a proprietary tool that he calls Cerebro internally that takes in large amounts of search data. And from that, he can develop kind of these personas or these audiences that he then cross-tabulates with different topics. So we can look at given audiences on given topics and see which words resonate, which themes resonate with a given audience. So we can start to have more informed conversation and use the language that helps us have, establish that common ground and say the same things so that we can move forward in the right direction. An example of that being is if you look over here on the screen or on either side, you can apply this data science tool he's developed or apply Cerebro to a given article or a large set of data. And what it does, or one of the things it does, is it can give us heat maps. So you look, and on the chart on the left is actually a heat map of how somebody who skews liberal in their conservative leanings reads that article. What words resonate? You can see a lot of green there. So they love that article, right? But when you look on the right, you have somebody who's more conservative leaning, and you see there's a lot of white and red on that chart, so neutral or negative. There's some nuance to how you read the chart, and a red word isn't always a bad word, because in communications you want some tension, right? To move the conversation along and to tell your story. But at the same time, it's clear to see at an aggregate level how this article is playing out to two different unique audiences. From there, we back out and we start to pull in a lot of data. We pull in a lot of articles. We pull in a lot of the websites that maybe some of you here represent. And we look at everything that we can scrape publicly online. And we look at this vast amount of anonymous data and say, okay, well, what can we learn from this? And two of the main principles I want you to remember from today is that different words mean the same thing, and by that I mean if you're on the liberal side of the spectrum, the word global actually is really going to resonate with you. But if you're on the right, the word international, speaking about the same thing, is more likely to be a word that you're comfortable with. And you can start to see the worldview that's infused in this language. So global is this kind of, we're all in it together, there's one way we should all be doing things, but on the right, and use a word like international, there's still some sovereignty there. I still want to maintain my ownership of something, but I'm fine to engage on the world stage. And in the middle, you have a column. These are shared words. These are words that we can use as a common language to have this conversation. And these aren't hard and fast rules, but it's definitely good guidelines as you think about the words and language we're using to connect with this audience. The next principle is that the same word often means different things. So you think about the word sustainable. Depending on how you use that word, it can mean a different thing to a different audience. On the left, political left, you see sustainable vehicles, you see a lot of words, and these are just examples, but you see a lot of words that relate to sustainable products, kind of proactively taking care of our earth and being mindful in our consumption. On the right, you see it's sustainable lifestyle. It's more about self-sufficiency and taking care of my own. In the middle, you can see how both of those apply to something like sustainable energy. And what this does is you back out further and you kind of expand the pool of language and words you start to analyze. Sorry, the slide's a little bit messed up there, but you can start to identify themes. And what's important for us as communicators is you can then use these themes to get into a conversation on climate change in a way that makes sense to your audience. So for the conservative audience, you can start to see words like, or themes like recreation and conservation or something that interests them as it relates to climate change. Consequences, self-sufficiency, if there are going to be catastrophic effects or droughts, you start to see, well, how does that affect my ability to be self-sufficient, something that's really important to this audience. Next, you see influencers and responsibility. They actually very much over-index in looking at who are the trusted influencers in their spheres that guide this conversation in their world. And so mouthpiece, the mouthpiece you use to have this conversation is really important. They over-index on searching for things like climate change related to the Pope or to the presidential candidates in the US. And last again, energy and self-sufficiency. How does it, and energy efficiency, sorry. How does that relate to my ability to take care of myself, my family, my community, et cetera? So beyond language, and I don't have time to go through all of that, so come find me after. We have a lot of data there. Is common ground. We at BonCom don't believe that it's enough to simply sit behind a desk and look at a screen and to say, okay, we know the audience. Our office is filled with the audience. But at the same time, you need to meet with the audience face to face, get to know them, hear what they have to say. So one of the things we've done is we had a breakthrough conference in Park City where we invited 40+ conservative influencers from around the country to come take part in a conversation about the Sustainable Development Goals. We shared everything BonCom had done, all our research, and then we did the most important thing we could have done is we kind of stopped talking and we listened to them. I wanted to say, you guys believe in a lot of these common goals, but what do you have to say about it? What do you have to say about what we shared with you? And I want to share a few things that we learned and a few things they shared with us. The first is that one of the things we heard loud and clear was that if you don't acknowledge the realities of the past or even the present conversation, that it's difficult to affect the reality of the future. We've talked a lot about, over the last 2 days, the reality of the future, of where we're headed. But oftentimes it becomes a sticking point in the conversation if you don't acknowledge that the conversation has been political for a long time. Maybe that science has evolved in different ways and maybe confused the conversation at some points, even though now it's starting to come to a point where we're all very aligned with where the world's going. But if you don't acknowledge those things, they remain barriers in the minds and in the conversations we want to have with this audience. So if you acknowledge those, you can defuse them early in the conversation and then work towards this common goal we have. Next, they said, yes, we agree with you on the problem, but if you say this is the problem and this is the only way to address that problem, we might tune out the whole conversation because we don't always agree with how to get there. So sometimes in communication and conversation, you have to agree that yes, we agree on the problem, but we need to open it up to many different kinds of solutions because we have different ways of coming at some of these issues than maybe you do. And so if you just say it's one-to-one, they might walk away. And if you communicate it that way, there's going to be an issue. This is something we've actually dealt with at BonCom. So we are right at the base of the Wasatch Mountains in Utah, in Salt Lake City. And at certain times of the year, it makes for beautiful scenery, but then other times we have what we call an inversion. Those mountains do a really nice job of trapping the pollution, right, kind of hovering over the city. And obviously we come from a very conservative state. But everyone agrees on this problem. As you can see there in the photo, it's hard not to agree when you can kind of taste the air that there is an issue. But when you start to put forward, you know, well, this is the one way to do it, the local residents were like, kind of stopped the conversation. And so working with one of our clients, Envision Utah, which is all about sustainable growth of our community, we said, okay, well, we all agree on the problems, but let's talk about potential solutions. So we issued a survey that was Your Utah, Your Future, and we let the community respond to this survey and say what they felt were the best ways to address this issue, along with some other issues related to sustainable growth of our city. And it had the highest public participation of any such survey in the United States up until that point. And so giving this audience the ability to have their voice heard and to define that, yes, there are multiple ways of going about it, and we're going to help you find and define the future. Coming towards the end here, another thing we heard, and this is something we more observed than was said kind of plainly in the conference. This issue of climate change is huge, right? And as we looked at a lot of the Sustainable Development Goals, people talked a lot about the scale and ambition and how, that was a bit daunting. And we kept talking about it on the world level, and they said, well, that's great, but I just can't connect with that for some reason. And obviously this New Yorker article here to the right is satirical, but it's very insightful. This idea that Americans are starting to worry about climate change now that it's affecting their lawns, right? But in all seriousness, until you start thinking about the conversation with kind of a quick handle when you're writing or you're communicating, think about the me, the we, and the world. How does it affect the individual you're talking to? How does it affect their community and their family? And then you can start to have the conversation about how it affects the world. Make it personal before you make it global. Because honestly, otherwise, I think we heard this earlier, if you don't do that and you don't follow that equation, it's a problem that affects other people, most likely living elsewhere, who probably live in the future. And so it's hard to get this audience particularly excited and activated against this issue if you don't kind of follow that communications equation to connect with them. The last thing I'll say is, so we've looked at a lot of the language. We've used data science to reverse engineer a lot of anonymous search data to get as insightful as we can. We've met with a lot of key influencers, but the next thing we want to do is further explore this topic and see how big and how scalable these insights are. And so we're going to start doing further qualitative and quantitative research. Come find me afterwards if you're interested in some of the results of that research or you want to participate. And with that, I'll say happy to be here and doing all we can to care for our common home. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Is that mic working? Thank you. I think we've got time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience.
Hi, I'm with the United Nations Association, the sort of civilian branch, and I often speak on the global goals, formerly the Millennium Development Goals, and we work for legislation and getting civilians active. My biggest obstacle is apathy. That they want to do something, but they feel powerless because everything seems so big. How do you bring the me home, especially with the SDGs or the global goals?
I wish we had invited you to the conference. So one of the things we actually did, you used a word that we activated against. So an exercise we do at BonCom and that we've developed through my strategy team is we write something called an apathy equation. And so when you look at the SDGs and climate change particularly, there's so many big issues, and when you combine them all into a list, it creates apathy. And so what we did is we had an activity, and I can come find me afterwards and I'll show you some of the charts I brought, but you start to just list them out very frankly, and you have to be honest with yourself that these are the barriers, whether true or not, whether real or not, whether right or not. Here are all the barriers, and you kind of list that out and put a plus in between each one and say this is all the things as an aggregate lead to apathy related to the category. And then and only then, once you isolate each individual element, then you then write what we call an activation blueprint, where you then start to address each one on the other side. And it's a nuanced conversation. It's not something you can do as a whole, but you have to start to address kind of each sub-part of it, one by one.
Excuse me. Sorry about that. So thank you, Richard. I think we're all out of time. We're going to go to our next session. But really appreciate it. Thank you.